Is anything better than an Article 5 commitment for Ukraine? Surprisingly, yes. One of the main outcomes of the Washington summit is a renewed focus from Europe on how to enforce a potential agreement that would end the Russia-Ukraine war. At first pass, this may seem premature. There is no peace yet, and so there is nothing to enforce. However, obtaining peace requires an expectation that the peace will work out, which in turn depends on expectations on how peacekeeping will work. Consequently, the best time to work out a peacekeeping strategy was approximately 3 years ago, but starting now is better than waiting around further. Unfortunately, the public discourse on the subject often misunderstands how good enforcement mechanisms work. Our task for this video is to push things in the right direction. So, today, I want to situate ourselves on a couple of dimensions. First, with some historical lessons from the Budapest Memorandum, and also by explaining why Ukraine will eventually join NATO. Then we will discuss solutions for security guarantees. First, granting Ukraine NATO membership and Article 5 privileges, which sounds good at first, but will not work in practice. And then the better solution of allied troop deployments to Ukraine. Also, pay special attention to the B-roll that I am using of Putin today. There is a game afoot, and if you stay with me until the end of the video, I will double your knowledge. But let's begin with some historical lessons from the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. You might remember this as the agreement among the United States, Russia, and Ukraine. The United Kingdom, Belarus, and Kazakhstan were also involved, but they tend not to get discussed and are superfluous to the key point for right now. Anyway, the Budapest Memorandum, on paper, traded Ukraine's legal claims to a nuclear weapons arsenal for assurances from the United States and Russia that they would not economically or militarily coerce the country. Note that I did not say Ukraine's nuclear weapons, because the bombs sitting in Ukraine were controlled by forces loyal to Moscow. And I did not say guarantee, because no promises were made to intervene on behalf of Ukraine in the event that someone else broke it. I know that assurance and guarantee sound synonymous to you and me, but lawyers specializing in international law draw a distinction here. Given that so much of international relations ends up back at don't listen to what leaders say, watch what they do, some credit ought to go to the Clinton administration for trying to make sure that Washington's planned actions matched what appeared in the memorandum. Keep that in mind for later when we get to NATO's Article 5 concerns. What really happened here is that Ukraine traded economic concessions from the United States and Russia in exchange for Moscow removing the nuclear weapons sitting in Ukraine, which, again, Ukraine did not have command and control over. The Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk, even as he was signing the memorandum, did not believe that it was worth the paper that it was printed on in terms of a guarantee, because it wasn't. If tomorrow Russia goes into Crimea, he said, no one will even raise an eyebrow. Aged like a fine wine. I am raising this point because every discussion of security guarantees today occurs in the shadow of the Budapest Memorandum. Thankfully, there is a healthy understanding that some real actions need to happen for a settlement to work here. This goes double as the West is trying to impose an artificial end to the war, which is not commensurate with what the Kremlin expects to capture should the war continue to a military conclusion, at least as it is currently being fought. A simple document is not going to cut it, even if you erase the word assurances and replace it with guarantees. The current situation calls for something that will actually alter behavior. The common solution that so many are moving toward is Ukraine's entry into NATO, and this is a section on why Ukraine, eventually, will become a NATO member. The cliché point here is that Ukraine is now the most experienced partner in the Western coalition when it comes to fighting a modern war. That is the type of knowledge that NATO countries need, and it will help make Ukraine one of the most valuable allies in the alliance when the day comes. Then there is a more subtle draw. The biggest threat to current members is a Russian invasion of the Baltics. How do you deter that from happening? Well, a simple step is to ensure that Russia pays an enormous price if it tries, thereby deterring the effort in the first place. And if February 2022 was any indication, you may need some overkill for that strategy to work. The thing is, there is no better place to mount potential costs than along the contact line with Ukraine. Imagine in the near future that the West arms Kyiv to the teeth. Then NATO will respond to any offensive to Europe's north by removing the restraints on Ukraine and asking Kyiv to launch a counteroffensive along the demilitarized zone. Of course, the best way to guarantee that offensive's success is to coordinate strategy with the rest of the Western coalition. Well, NATO at its core is one gigantic coordination device. Thus, we have another reason for Ukraine to join. Obviously, you hear plenty about what is happening right now, and the United States' position that Ukraine will not join NATO as part of any agreement to end the war. Some have interpreted this as Trump is in favor of a final agreement where Ukraine will never join NATO. But there are a few problems with this. One, I have not seen the word never, as in not forever, appear in a statement from the White House. Please correct me if I am wrong there. But no NATO is not never NATO. Two, even if Trump did say that, the thing is that Trump is constrained by mortality like the rest of us. There is no world where he could enforce that forever. The next president could just come along and decide differently, and there would be no real recourse to it. Welcome to the world of international politics and unenforceable contracts. 3. If you wanted something that would be harder to repeal, you would need the Senate to ratify a treaty with a 2/3 majority. That is not happening on this front. So, yes, unless something major happens that fundamentally alters the course of politics in the region, Ukraine will eventually join NATO. But that caveat aside, joining NATO now is neither a practical solution, nor would it do what the people pushing for it believe it will. You will remember that the overarching concern for an enforcement mechanism is that it actually needs to change behavior. Otherwise, you end up back at the Budapest Memorandum, which will fail for a second time. Now, it might be easy to dismiss Article 5 as mere words that do not affect actions. But not so fast. When you become a member of NATO, you enter a reciprocal agreement. I will protect you if you protect me. As a result, entering the agreement and then failing to follow through terminates the deal, and therefore leaves you without future protection. In turn, committing to the alliance does alter your behavior, because, outside of unusual circumstances, that future reciprocal protection is worth the cost that you must pay today. This is, in part, why NATO created the requirement that potential members have settled territorial boundaries, because existing members do not want to inherit a pre-existing conflict. It is fine to protect a new member in expectation from some threat that may arise later, but admitting a country that already is in conflict implicitly means joining that conflict. Aside from that practical problem, the NATO now theory of Ukrainian security guarantees misunderstands the causal effect of Article 5. Remember how I mentioned that the United States tried to get the language of the Budapest Memorandum to reflect the reality of the US commitment? Well, NATO tries to do the same thing with Article 5. More explicitly, it is not Article 5 per se that generates the protective value. Instead, it is all of the steps that go into getting into NATO that lends credibility to Article 5. You have heard me make this analogy before in other domains, but it is especially accurate here. If you are doing things right, then the causal effect of a marriage on a relationship should be fairly small. The reason that married couples stay together longer than random non-married couples is that they have been together for long enough to know that the relationship is a good idea in general. The marriage may be a nice additional glue, but the marriage itself is not what does the work. Marriages do not save relationships. And if you try to bind together a couple that did not voluntarily choose to marry, you will soon discover that the marriage in question is not worth the paper that the license is printed on. The analogy is basically a perfect fit for NATO. You remember what they call this, right? It is literally the family photo. NATO is a marriage of countries instead of people. It has some causal effect on the relationship, thanks to the reciprocal principle of Article 5. But it is the glue that binds together something bigger. Instead, the real effect is in the admissions process, the current form of which traces back to the 1999 summit in Washington. Under traditional circumstances, states receive a membership action plan that details the various hurdles the country needs to clear before joining the alliance. Following the 2023 summit, though, Ukraine's path will not formalize this step. However, the key components have not really changed. Do not think of Article 5 as working because a piece of paper says that it works. Instead, think of Article 5 as working because going through all of the requirements that NATO has for admission makes the applicant countries worth defending. They have economic ties to other member states, which makes the incumbent allies want to protect their foreign investments. They are democratic countries that will uphold Western political principles within the alliance and elsewhere. They heavily invest in their militaries, and therefore will not be a drag on collective defense. They have reformed their militaries to NATO standards, and can therefore fight with their NATO allies, rather than just fight at the same time as them. If you think about the status quo as it relates to Ukraine here, there are some significant gaps. Let's go through a checklist of the 4 key points. Regarding trade, Ukraine is not yet in the European Union, and it is hard to imagine that Ukraine enters NATO before becoming an EU member. Regarding government structure, Ukraine is a democratic country, but its history is not inspiring. Let's do a quick rundown. 2004. The election had to be rerun after fraud and massive protests. 2010. Looks good, but then again, won by someone who eventually fled to Russia. 2014. The election itself was fine, but it only happened because the aforementioned sitting president had fled to Russia during the Revolution of Dignity. 2019. No problems here. 2024. As you know, never happened because the Constitution forbids elections in times of war. There are plans for elections as soon as the war ends, of course, but the problem still remains that allies want to see an established record of democratic elections and the peaceful transfer of power. And we ought not forget that Zelensky established himself as a political player inside of Ukraine by starring in a TV show that lampooned how rampant corruption is within the country. He also did Ukraine no favors by trying to pass a bill that moved anti-corruption oversight to the executive branch. Europe had an aneurysm over the whole thing because Europe wants Ukraine to move closer to EU membership, and that was not helping. Domestically, there were large protests in response, quite a move considering air raids are a daily feature of life in Kyiv. They then killed the whole thing, which is better than not, but still not reassuring from Europe's perspective. If you are wondering why this is such a sticking point, think about the NATO countries experiencing democratic backsliding now. You know who they are. And you also know how much of a headache they caused the alliance over the last few years. Allies put up with this because NATO is a glue, but the existing group does not want to glue itself to someone who has an elevated risk of causing problems later. Next on the checklist is military spending. Okay, we got one there. That is not a problem for Ukraine. Actually, it is Ukraine's main selling point here. Doctrine is a bit of a problem, though. Prior to the invasion, Ukraine was working on this aspect of the prerequisites. But all of that got put on hold in February 2022. Turns out, it is not a good idea to change doctrine in the middle of a war. Instead, it will have to be something for Ukraine to work on once a ceasefire is put into place. Returning to the wedding analogy for a second, Ukraine and the existing NATO allies are essentially dating right now. I guess it is polygamous dating, but it is dating nonetheless. A shotgun wedding is not going to convince anyone in the Kremlin that NATO countries are actually committed to Ukraine. Until the checklist gets finished, all Ukraine's membership does is water down Article 5. Look, I get why a lot of the online commentary looks to Article 5 as a solution. Because if you treat Article 5 as a binding contract, it does everything that you would want it to do. The problem is that treaties in international relations do not inherently bind. They need to be self-enforcing. And at least in this respect, Article 5 is not self-enforcing without all of those steps beforehand. It may seem odd, but two things can be true at once. One, NATO's Article 5 is the greatest provision that any alliance has ever created, and it is not even close. Credit to the guys that you are seeing now for figuring that out all the way back in 1949. And two, Article 5 in isolation is meaningless. Just to drive home that point, the European Union has similar language, and no one cares about it. There is also something known as the Rio Treaty that has the same an attack against one as an attack against all clause for American countries, but most people have never heard of the Rio Treaty. Those organizations do not set the same standards, and thus they do not have the same bite despite the similar language. That takes us to our last main task for the day, to figure out some real enforcement solutions. And again, we should frame this in terms of the previous problem, that there needs to be some doing here to alter behavior. Let me go through a few commonly suggested options beyond Ukraine joining NATO, and see where they don't work, or maybe do. There is one plan to arm Ukraine to the teeth once a ceasefire begins, which would dissuade Russia from trying to restart the war. Well, sure, that should be part of whatever system you put into place. But it defies logic to think that it will get everything to work out. At the risk of exposing a state secret here, you do not need to wait around for a ceasefire to send in more arms. You could just send those arms in right now. I am sure that Ukraine would find the long-term commitment to be more believable if Europe is sending the proper costly signal in the present, because "we will send the costly signal later" is not exactly reassuring. Never mind that armaments today correspondingly move today's line, and that is also good for Europe. Then there is the 24-hour plan that Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has proposed, which would give the coalition of the willing 1 day to decide how to respond to a Russian violation of a ceasefire. Okay, but that just sets an alarm clock to declare that you are not going to help. Again, it does not alter behavior in a meaningful way, and it is also not going to influence Russia's opinion on the matter. The last of the proposals commonly cited is to give Ukraine Article 5-like guarantees. Create an agreement that says an attack on Ukraine is an attack against all, where all here means a certain coalition of the willing. This sidesteps the problem of having to convince every member of NATO to agree to it, but it suffers from the same general problem as immediate NATO membership from Ukraine. It is not Article 5 itself that lends credibility to the promise. It is everything that goes into joining NATO. What this ultimately must come down to, therefore, is committing to place boots on the ground. It seems that much of the discussion within the Western coalition has shifted to this framework, which is a good start. However, there are a couple of points to work out. One is just how far to go. Unlike the alternative strategies, placing European troops inside of Ukraine has a tangible effect. At minimum, it facilitates action should Russia re-engage. Put differently, it is easier for Europe to say, "go fight," when the troops are a couple of 100 kilometers away from the action, than it is if they are sitting at home, unprepared and unready. It would also make Russia think twice about launching missiles into areas where European troops are stationed. Thus, you get a nice combination of deterrence, plus a bonus if deterrence fails. The more extreme version of this would put European troops right on top of the front lines to form a true tripwire. Any advance that Russia makes at that point would necessarily kill European troops, forcing them to return fire, and removing anyone in Brussels from vetoing the action. The European casualties would then further galvanize support at home to pursue retaliation against the Russian forces responsible. The trade-off for Europe is that forward-deployed soldiers open up a greater risk of accident, or rogue Russian soldier spiraling us into World War III. We have already seen iconic images of the First Cold War. We may soon start seeing iconic images of the Second Cold War. The other point to work out is the logistics of the whole thing, because one does not simply start a peacekeeping mission. In both what I have read online and in the private conversations that I have had with people who might know something, basically nothing there is happening so far. A meaningful peacekeeping mission would require thousands of soldiers, which means preparing deployments, moving materiel, and setting up a base. To give you an idea of just how far away from reality an end to the war is, even under a rushed timeline, that would take weeks. So, yes, it seems like the Washington summit gathered momentum for Europe to start planning this phase of the conflict. But it still feels more like concepts of a plan than a real plan ready to put into action. Moving to a lighter subject, did you catch the running theme of all of the B-roll that I used of Putin today? You might remember in my last video how I dissected the conspiracy theory that a Putin double attended the Alaska summit, because the real Putin does not emote, except anyone that spends a little bit of time watching B-roll of Putin knows that, in fact, he does when the situation calls for it. Well, the conspiracy theory moved to the fact that Putin was in close contact with others, which is something that he never does. At least this part of the conspiracy theory has a kernel of truth behind it. During the pandemic, Putin did indeed exercise some extreme social distancing. The broader public became aware of this thanks to the humorously large table that he and Macron negotiated over in the days before the invasion began. And just so we're clear, they were negotiating about the invasion over the table. They were not negotiating over who would keep the table and take it home with them. However, Putin's social distancing has come and gone, as you saw in all of the B-roll from today. Now, if you wrote one of these comments, just like last time about Putin emoting, I cannot blame you for not knowing this. Trust me when I say that it is better to have hobbies that do not involve measuring how far away a Russian leader sits from others. But it is still true that people in a position of responsibility to report on these matters also have the responsibility to do the due diligence to know that Putin brushes elbows with others just like the rest of us. Meanwhile, the rest of us might enjoy reading these books about the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.